Farm track outside Romorantin, central France, an hour or so after midnight. The moon is thin, more suggestion than light, and the air smells of cut hay and damp earth. A young man kneels at the edge of the lane, his hands moving with a steadiness that betrays months of practice rather than calm nerves. Beside him, a battered leather satchel lies open, and inside it, nestled in straw, sits something the size of a large tin of boot polish. He lifts it out, presses it flat against the rutted surface where lorry tires have worn the ground smooth, and covers it carefully with a thin scattering of soil and gravel. Then he is gone, melting into the hedgerow, leaving behind an object weighing barely more than a bag of sugar that will, within hours, bring a German supply convoy grinding to a halt. This is not a story about a single bomb. It is the story of a weapon so small that a man could carry half a dozen in a shopping bag, and so effective that it forced an occupying army to treat every meter of French, Yugoslav, and Greek roadway as potentially lethal ground. Roads that should have meant safety, speed, and the comfort of distance from the front line instead became corridors of dread. That transformation, from open road to open question, is what this story is about. By 1940, Britain found itself in a position with no obvious precedent. An army had been pushed off the continent at Dunkirk, leaving behind tanks, artillery, and ammunition. The nation that remained had factories, a navy, and a great deal of defiance, but precious little in the way of heavy weaponry it could spare for the people now living under occupation across Europe. And yet those people, in France, Norway, Yugoslavia, Greece, and beyond, represented something Britain could not manufacture, a population already in place, already moving among the enemy, already positioned to do damage no bomber crew or commando raid could match. The problem was supply. How do you arm a farmer, a school teacher, or a railway clerk to fight a mechanized army, when anything you give them has to fit under a coat, survive a parachute drop into a moonlit field, and not draw suspicion if discovered in a barn? Conventional anti-tank weapons were useless for this purpose. The standard British anti-tank mine of the period weighed several kilograms, required digging, and needed specialist handling to avoid killing the person laying it. None of that suited a resistance fighter who might have 90 seconds in the dark before a German patrol came round the bend. Existing demolition charges, meanwhile, were designed by engineers for engineers, full of switches and timers that assumed proper training and proper time. The people Britain needed to arm had neither. What was required was something almost absurdly simple: a weapon that an ordinary civilian, given perhaps a single afternoon's instruction, could place on a road in under a minute and trust to work without them needing to understand why. There was a further difficulty, one of arithmetic rather than engineering. Even if such a device existed, it had to be small enough that an aircraft could drop dozens, then hundreds, then eventually thousands of them into the same field without filling an entire bomber's bomb bay. Every kilogram saved in the weapon's weight was a kilogram available for radios, ammunition, or another weapon entirely. The challenge, in short, was to compress the destructive power of an anti-tank mine into something that weighed almost nothing, cost almost nothing, and asked almost nothing of the person using it. To most ordnance engineers of the day, this looked less like a design brief and more like a contradiction. The answer came from a peculiar corner of wartime Britain, the Ministry of Supply's experimental establishment at MD1, sometimes nicknamed Churchill's Toy Shop, tucked away at the Frythe, a requisitioned country house in Hertfordshire. Working under the engineer Stuart McCrae and the irrepressible Major Millis Jefferis, the team there specialized in precisely the sort of unglamorous, practical inventiveness that grand institutions tended to overlook. Their answer to the road mining problem was officially designated the number 75 grenade, though almost everyone who handled one simply called it the Hawkins Mine, after its association with that workshop's freewheeling culture of trial, error, and rapid iteration. What Jefferis and his colleagues produced was a flattened metal canister, roughly the dimensions of a large sandwich tin, weighing in at just under a kilogram. Inside sat a charge of explosive, and across its top ran a pressure plate connected to a simple chemical igniter. There was no clockwork, no battery, no electronics of any kind. The genius of the thing lay in what it did not require. Press down on the plate hard enough, and a small file inside would crush, releasing acid onto a sensitive compound that flashed instantly into the main charge. The weight of a car wheel was more than sufficient. A man's boot, applied carelessly, often was too. Picture a paving slab cut down to the size of a paperback book, and you have roughly the footprint of the thing. The sound it produced when it detonated beneath a vehicle has been described by witnesses as something between a car door slamming shut and a sharp clap of thunder, compressed into a fraction of a second, sharp enough to be heard streets away, yet localized enough that, in open countryside, it could pass for nothing more than a vehicle's tire bursting until the smoke cleared and the wheel, or the axle, was found to be gone entirely. Several of the mines, daisy-chained together with detonating cord, multiplied the effect considerably, capable of breaking the track of a medium tank rather than merely a lorry's wheel. This versatility, light enough for one purpose, lethal enough for another, was precisely what made it so attractive to planners desperate to do more with less. Manufacture was deliberately unglamorous. Simple pressed steel components and a straightforward explosive fill meant the mine could be turned out in significant numbers without diverting scarce machine tool capacity from aircraft or shipping production. Exact production figures remain difficult to pin down with confidence, since wartime ordnance records were not always kept with future historians in mind, but estimates drawn from surviving Special Operations executive paperwork suggest that production likely ran into the hundreds of thousands of units over the course of the war, a great many of which found their way by parachute and by submarine into occupied Europe. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The mine's true effectiveness, however, lay not in any single explosion but in the psychological shadow it cast over every road in occupied territory. In the lead-up to the Normandy invasion in June 1944, resistance networks across France received instructions, relayed by coded BBC broadcasts, to begin large-scale sabotage of German lines of communication. Hawkins mines, supplied in their thousands through SOE airdrops, were laid on rural roads throughout Brittany, the Dordogne, and the approaches to Normandy itself, often in combination with felled trees or damaged bridges to funnel traffic into ambush points where the mines waited. German after-action reports from this period, where they survive, complain repeatedly of convoys delayed, vehicles disabled, and the maddening unpredictability of routes that had been clear the previous day. In Yugoslavia, Tito's partisans employed similar British-supplied mines against roads used by German garrison forces moving between towns in difficult, hilly terrain where alternative routes scarcely existed, forcing convoys onto predictable paths that resistance fighters could mine and watch. Greek resistance fighters used them on mountain roads serving German garrisons, where a single disabled lorry could block a pass for hours. Precise figures for vehicles destroyed or casualties inflicted are, frustratingly, not available in any comprehensive form. Much of this fighting generated little paperwork on either side, and what records exist are scattered, partial, and occasionally contradictory. What is well documented, by contrast, is the change in German behavior. Convoy escorts increased. Engineers were assigned to sweep roads ahead of military traffic, a task that consumed manpower the occupying forces could ill afford to spare. Soldiers wrote home and were recorded by intelligence officers afterwards, describing a creeping unease about traveling any route that was not under constant, visible guard. Germany attempted nothing quite comparable in concept, though not for lack of capability. German anti-tank mines, such as the Teller mine, were robust, effective weapons, but they were designed for conventional defensive minefields laid by trained engineers along a static front, not for clandestine sabotage by civilians. Where the Wehrmacht did experiment with man-portable demolition charges for irregular warfare, These tended towards complexity, multiple safety mechanisms, switches requiring trained hands, reflecting a military culture less inclined to trust untrained partisans with simplified ordnance, partly because Germany's occupied populations were rarely intended to be armed allies in the way Britain treated resistance movements. The Americans, entering the resistance supply business somewhat later through the Office of Strategic Services, adopted broadly similar small anti-tank mines for their own clandestine drops, and in several documented instances simply requested stocks of the British Hawkins design rather than developing a rival from scratch, a quiet but telling endorsement of Jeffress's original engineering. Assessing the precise material impact of the Hawkins mine on the German war effort is, like so much of irregular warfare, an exercise in educated estimation rather than firm accounting. The number of vehicles destroyed, while clearly substantial across the whole of occupied Europe, was never going to single-handedly determine the outcome of a continental war. Its significance lay instead in the diversion it forced. Troops pulled from frontline duties to perform road clearance, fuel and time wasted on detours, and perhaps most importantly, the erosion of a basic assumption that occupied territory was safely held territory. An army that must fear the ground behind its own front line is an army already fighting two wars rather than one. Surviving examples of the No. 75 grenade can today be found in several collections, including the Imperial War Museum in London, where its modest, unremarkable appearance, easily mistaken for a tin of paint, continues to surprise visitors expecting something more obviously fearsome. Return for a moment to that farm track outside Romorantin. The young man who placed the mine that night was not a soldier in any formal sense, and the device he carried bore no resemblance to the artillery pieces and tanks that dominate the popular image of the Second World War. It was small enough to overlook, cheap enough to mass-produce by the 100,000, and simple enough that an afternoon's instruction was all that separated a farmer from a saboteur. And yet that unassuming tin, no larger than a sandwich box, achieved something that entire armored divisions struggled to manage. It made an occupying force afraid of empty space. There is a particular kind of fear that comes not from visible danger but from its absence, the dread of a quiet road, a still field, a lane with no sign of life anywhere along it. The Hawkins mine manufactured that fear deliberately and distributed it, by parachute, across an entire continent. German soldiers who had marched through France in 1940 without serious resistance found themselves, 4 years later, eyeing every rut and pothole with suspicion. Convoys that had once rolled confidently along rural routes now crawled forward behind engineers sweeping the verges. The road, that oldest symbol of military control and freedom of movement, had been quietly turned against the very army that controlled it. It did not win the war alone. No single weapon ever does. But in workshops at a requisitioned country house in Hertfordshire, a handful of engineers solved a problem that had seemed almost philosophically impossible: how to arm the unarmed, how to threaten an empire with little more than tin, acid, and explosive, and how to make a tank-busting weapon light enough to fit in a poacher's pocket. They built something small enough to be forgotten and powerful enough to be feared. That, in the end, is the quiet, unglamorous legacy of the No. 75 grenade. Proof that the most effective weapon is sometimes not the loudest or the largest, but the one that makes an entire army afraid of the road ahead.